Welcome to the Cannabis Data Science Meetup Group. So we meet here to talk about cannabis data, do some exploratory analysis, crunch some numbers, have fun in general. So just to give a brief introduction, my name is Keegan. I've started working in the cannabis industry as a laboratory analyst, where I did everything from hands-on analysis, so just the sample preparation, and gradually found some ways to automate some of the lab work. Next thing you know, I'm a software developer, and I've now launched a company, Cannalytics, primarily to help provide software solutions to help people in the cannabis industry's lives, primarily lives to be easier. And then there's just such a high demand for analytics. And so that's what my background's in. So just trying to lend a hand. And how about yourself, Stephen? I guess Paul and Heather can introduce themselves here in a second. So I'm curious what brings you to the group today.
So surprisingly, I am not a cannabis user, and I don't intend to be. My interest actually is about terpenes. And so terpenes are also interesting to many cannabis users. And my interest is in plant terpenes. So I'm a consultant to a natural products company that makes insect repellents based on natural products. And plant products are, most of what you smell are volatile molecules, which are terpenes, 10 carbon molecules that are terpenes. And so I'm very, very interested in terpenes, modeling terpenes, and particularly understanding by plant species like rosemary and so forth, what they are, if you take the essential oils or press them or use distillation to take the oils out, what is the relative contribution of the different constituent molecules, constituent terpenes? And so I've done a fair amount of work in that area. And then I'm very interested in the tidyverse and modeling and so forth. So it turns out that one of the inexpensive ways of trying to understand plant terpenes more generally, or like outside of marijuana, well, it turns out if you want to understand that stuff, the inexpensive way to go is to use the marijuana testing labs. So I'm interested in understanding more about the marijuana testing labs. Also, reportedly, some of the labs are cheating by showing higher THC, and I also see inconsistencies reported between the labs for the same product. And so I'd like to understand a little bit more about that, because from a production perspective, I'd like to incorporate marijuana testing labs in production of our plant-based insect repellent. So it's a mosquito repellent, shipping and so forth, but to go through and just easily go through and test, which primarily I'm interested in the terpenes. So.
Fantastic. Your interests align with the group perfectly well. So we looked at a lot of laboratory data. Mm-hmm. Terpene data is particularly interesting and an area that we have neglected so far. So we've been working with this data set from Washington State, where we have a rich set of cannabinoid data. So, and even, in fact, Paul and I were talking about this briefly. So it's essentially, we're interested in maybe trying to see, okay, is there any, hybrid sativa indica distinction in the numbers? And so I know people have done work with that and looking at terpenes. So yeah, it would be interesting to see. So long story short, I think you're in the right place, and in fact, we may have a lot to learn from you as well.
Great.
And awesome. We'll maybe return to that here in a second. Just to go ahead and go around the group. So Adam, another new face. So it's good to see you here. Would you be interested in introducing yourself to the group? If not, Heather and Paul, you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves to Stephen real quick? So Paul?
Sure. Hi, Stephen. My name is Paul Kitko. My day job, I'm a data scientist with one of the big three automotive manufacturers. What brought me here is I was actually finished up a master's degree in data science, and I was looking for a big, juicy data set to get my hand on to do my capstone project. Keegan was helpful in getting me started in that area. So I was using this Washington State data set to do some what's called market basket analysis, some retail analysis on sales and dispensaries. So I just wrapped that up last week officially. So I'm done with my master's program now. So thanks, Keegan.
Congratulations, Paul.
Thank you. And also, Stephen, you mentioned the tidyverse. I like using the tidyverse because it seems to be, at least for me, I'm not a natural born programmer. And in fact, if I didn't have to be programming, that'd be great. But it seems the tidyverse is very approachable and easy to use. So that's my tool of choice as well. That's about it.
That's interesting. So whenever there's multiple lines of agreement, I get interested. So what's this tidyverse? And this is a data wrangling tool?
So in R, there's a package of it's a huge collection of packages for data analysis and statistical analysis, and it's just written in a way, at least from my perspective, that's easy to pick up. It's actually, to me, it's easier than Python, so that's kind of why I gravitated towards it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I could maybe supplement Paul's comments. So generally, you'll find people who are doing production work. That is to say, people have come up from this computer science background. Typically, they'll have learned Python in school, and they like Python. And it also feeds into machine learning well. People who are statisticians or PhDs coming from areas that are not computer science, typically they'll use R. R is it's been around for many years. As Paul's indicated, there's now a new collection, a sub-collection, if you will, of highly integrated tools. So they snap together like Legos, and goes out of one, goes into the next. Okay, so you can have these, you can think of them as block modules, and so you can kind of, connect these modules together to do hugely creative things. So you don't have, it's abstracted for you, that is to say. So instead of trying to get down at the bit and byte level, you're dealing at a higher level of abstraction, kind of like Visio or, so forth. So the advantage here is, as Paul's pointed out, people who are not programmers can move quickly, I say relatively quickly, with complicated data sets. So once you get a data set, for example, that's beyond 2 pages of Excel, it starts to be really difficult to try to understand, to visualize it, to model it, to just clean it up, all that sort of things. And so there's a fellow named Hadley Wickham who has instigated this thing called the tidyverse, and it basically looks at the complete workflow. So if you start off with, hey, I got some raw data, it's always messy. Maybe 70% of your time is spent cleaning up that dirty data. And then you want to start saying, well, what do it mean? What can I do with it? And how can it help inform my business? So there are a lot of tools around visualization. That's an important first step. And then trying to characterize what equations or what algorithms might model that, and what might that inform about, what you do on a go forward basis. So for example, you might say, hey, I have a current, I grow marijuana right now, and I want to increase a certain terpene. How can I do it? Well, one way you might try doing that is get some insects in to start munching on it, because terpenes are made by plants to keep, munching insects away. Or just, you might say, I'm going to give it less water. See what happens. You just stress it different ways, and then you'll get different data. And if you have that different data, then you can start to model it and say, hey, if I give it 10% less water and 20% more light, what does that do to the resulting product?
You're hitting on something real clever. So this is something that yeah, several people are talking about it, and even somebody's talking about with Canlytics is essentially, yeah, so just measuring some of the inputs in your production and trying to estimate some of the yields, or at least some of the effects on the yields.
Yeah, I mean, if you were doing a production process of manufacturing something, you'd monitor it. You'd say, here's what I expect to be in spec when it comes out of the production line. With natural products, especially, well, I know more about essential oils than I do about marijuana, but in natural oils, the way it's recovered is there's different ways to do it. You can physically compress it to squeeze out oil, or you could do something called steam distillation. That gives you two separate products. So that's a processing example that you might want to change or adjust your process. On the growing side, it's a lot like growing wine. Okay, the terroir makes a difference. So what's in the soil, the water, the sun, all that stuff will greatly change the essential oil composition. So just as a general point, I would say there's probably some lessons to be taken from looking at just general plant science and then applying those to the specific case of marijuana, because there's a lot of conservation across plant types. So what happens in one species of plant very likely shows up in another species of plant as well, but different effect sizes.
And this is where we like the cross-pollination of ideas. And then just to introduce our two new guests real quick. So essentially, Adam, his mic's not working, but in the chat, Adam's also getting a master's degree in data science. So Paul's proving this is quite useful. And then you have experience working with cannabis companies in California. So excellent. We'd love to hear from you there. California is one of the states we haven't really studied too much in depth. So it'd be interesting to hear your take on things in the markets there. And now, Sasha, it's awesome to have you as well. So welcome to the group. If you want to take just 30 seconds to introduce yourself, you're more than welcome to.
Sure. I don't actually have a data science degree. I just have done some data sciencey things. So I'm a data engineer and BI engineer. And so currently I'm working on building softwares for the cannabis industry, specifically banking and eventually a point of sale. So the intent is to be for Oklahomans by Oklahomans, and to try to ensure that if Oklahomans are going to spend money on a point of sale system, that it should be an Oklahoma-based one, so that revenue stays in Oklahoma and that those taxes stay in Oklahoma and helps the community. So I am here to glean as much information from all of you brilliant individuals and hopefully be able to contribute as well.
Well, it's awesome to have you, Sasha. That's an area that we would love to learn from you about, what's going on with banking.
Yeah.
We do talk a bit about sales. So Paul is probably the sales expert at the moment.
Nice.
And in fact, we'll have a little bit of Oklahoma data to look at today, just a little bit, but bite size to get us to start talking about this next idea.
Great.
So I guess just to go ahead and to dive into what I was looking at.
Sorry, Keegan. This is Paul. I think we forgot Heather.
Oh, Heather.
No. Don't worry about it. I really appreciate you saying that. It's all good. Thank you.
Hi, Heather.
I'm all right.
Well,
hey, Sasha.
Well, Heather's an awesome attendee, and it is relevant because so essentially, started just looking at a map. A map here of, okay, so like I started thinking, okay, so let's start to really just start to get our our ear to the ground and really start to figure out how much in sales in cannabis is really going on. Because so we started talking about sales last week, and so we've been primarily looking at Washington State. And so there are, polls out there with companies estimating, the size of illegal markets or the size of the legal markets. But, here at the, Cannabis Data Science group, we try to, get our hands on the data ourselves and, crunch these numbers ourselves. So I figured, so why don't this could be a little bit of an undertaking, but here in the next couple of weeks, I think we can do this. So essentially, I thought that, okay, why don't we try to make the Cannabis Data Science meetup group estimation of the size of the cannabis market. So that way, Leafly and New Frontier Data, they have their estimates. And so then we can add our estimate to the hat to see how it compares. And so, and what'll be cool is we'll have all of our, tools and sources as open source. So that way, someone can follow in our footsteps. So, but long story short, we're going to have to do a little bit of homework here because, so for example, they have New York as fully legal. However, as we know, and even so, for example, they've got Virginia as fully legal. And so I started looking in the, the regulations here for Virginia, and I believe things really don't, kick off until 2023. So
Right.
exactly. So, oh yeah, and so this is where Heather may be interested. So Heather is essentially let this dot. And that was the other thing is I started to think about the interesting location of Maryland. And so, Maryland's, surrounding DC, and then, like you said, you've got Virginia, which is not technically legal, but they've got some time to wait. So long story short, there's a couple factors to look at here. And so without further ado, I'll just start showing you some of the data that I've started collecting. So basically, we've been looking at a lot at the supply side. And the reason being is, the supply side data is quite clean. So they've got the seed to sale tracking systems. So they relatively have a good measure of sales that are happening. And so, and so that is essentially where supply and demand meet. So that's the market's cleared. That's equilibrium at our total sales right there. However, we've only been looking at the supply side of the picture. And so, I'm sure everybody.
Can you go through your data sheet? I put it on a bigger screen here because I got eye problems. I need a big screen for spreadsheets. But
I see.
You have not described your data. That is to say, when you've got it on the screen there, but you need to go through the columns, at least for me, to explain what are we looking at.
Yes. So let's look at it. Hold on 1 second here. Sure. I'll show you some of the visualizations here. So for example, started to just look at some of the data here in Maryland. And so now we're starting to, okay, so for example, we've got we've got Maryland sales. Right. So you see, in Maryland, we've got a nice, they've got a steady increase in sales. At the same time, there's more and more patients. So if you were, only looking at the sales, it would be just, kind of hard to explain this. And so then, okay, well, that can be maybe explained by the number of patients. And so, well, maybe the number of patients that may essentially track along with population. So, or maybe it may the number of people signing up may be outpacing any change in population. So, long story short, some of the variables that I thought would be worth looking at would be essentially we'll start making panel data. So we'll keep track of the state and we'll keep track of the date. And what's nifty is the census has recently come out with the 2020 estimates. So we can now get relatively recent, population for all the various states. So this is where you see things there start to be some estimates. So for example, we just have the fixed point 2020 population for Maryland. And so now if we're starting to incorporate population into our analysis, do we, start assuming that population's growing, or do we just leave population as a constant? And, so.
It's hard to get constants in this case. Like when I looked at this data first, I thought that I could use the number of caregivers. So in this case, these are people that don't necessarily have to have their Maryland card, but they would arrive at the dispensary to pick up the product for the intended patient. So I thought that that was a measure too, but it does go up, but not nearly to explain the monthly increase. So anyway, yeah, it's like 2% of the population in Maryland is roughly holds a card. So we don't know about the other types of sales, but for legal sales in this case, yeah, 2% of the population.
Exactly. And Stephen, were you going to make a comment here?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just a few things. One would be I would get rid of the cents on your column, column D and column.
Which one?
For your revenue and total patients, just for clarity and for easy scanning, you might just get rid of the .00.
Yes.
So it's just, I mean, I realize it's a small thing, but trying to understand it and on a go forward basis, that'd be nice. The same thing for total revenue. And then also revenue per patient, like just round it to the nearest dollar. That will make things easier when you go to start plotting it and printing it and have labeled points and stuff, because it's not really significant to have, you're showing 6 significant digits, and it's obviously it's not significant beyond the dollar.
Oh, yes.
So that'd be the first thing. And then as far as making it more readily understood, the next thing is that, of course, the population number is not going to change once the census is set. I don't know that there's a way to show incremental increases to the census data. So that's going to be a static thing for the next 10 years or something. If you're looking for additional things, you might want to break that population down, but by age tranche. Because I think that you'll find that marijuana use, legal and illegal, or sanctioned or unsanctioned, whatever, is not consistent across ages and across gender. So I would think that that'd be useful. Further, if you do it for one state, like we do it for Maryland, you might find that model will carry over to other states. So you mentioned that you might like to do some predictions versus other states. I suggest diving down on one state, maybe Maryland, and understand that really well, and then say, hey, people in Maryland might be similar to other states. So there's a really nice database of census information that's free from the US government. It's census.gov or something. So you can pull down a whole bunch of very specific information. For example, you might want to model this if you've got data, dispensary data by zip code in Maryland. You can then go back and say, hey, in this zip code, there's this, here's the distribution, the population distribution by age and gender, as well as income distributions. So you can do a lot of that stuff to get a better model. So in other words, I guess what I'm really getting at is you could choose to dive down onto Maryland, come up with a characterization of Maryland based on characteristics that you get from census data, and then pretty quickly just flip it around and saying, hey, if the rest of the states were like Maryland, here's what we would expect to see. Okay. And that may be really different than, I think your other people are more likely to say, hey, what do we think's happening? Or they'll get at it, they'll try to derive their estimate of the US market a different way. But if you did it this way, it would be a useful, I think, I mean, I'm imagining not knowing anything about your industry really, but my guess is that they're not coming at it from a deep dive on one. This is like, you could use the Maryland data as a sample of the US. It's a biased sample, but it's still, it's not bad. And you have it, that's some information that you can get. So, so again, we look back at the population. I recommend splitting that by age tranche, and you can do that easily, as I say, but at the census, it's like census.org or something. They have data sets you can download, and I'd start first by just looking at Maryland and trying to understand Maryland well.
Exactly.
And then from there, and so that, the first thing I would do is I download population data from Maryland, and I do that. There's typically they'll break it by zip code, or there's something else called a FIPS, F-I-P-S code. So just two different ways. I think the census maybe it has both. But the thing that's nice about that is that you can get a lot of correlations.
Exactly.
You know.
And so you've hit on basically the what's key here. So we're basically so if you can see my screen, basically I just have these quick facts from Maryland. And so with some states, you're right, we can get more granular. So Washington State, Colorado, you may be able to get number of licensees by county in Oklahoma, perhaps. I believe you can, because you know the county of the licensee, so you could at least get licensees by county. So with certain states, it can be a bit more granular. We're almost at just trying to do like a national demand or for cannabis. And so the long story short, I like your idea, and it's in this similar vein where we're trying to aggregate these explanatory variables and see if they can't help us predict demand in other states. So basically the idea was, okay, so we can get the revenue in Maryland. And so, this is about 2% of the population, or the patients are 2% of the population. Mm-hmm. And they're spending, on average, almost $400 a month. And so looking at, looking at actually a smaller state, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma's population's a little more than half of Maryland. And here, you have, so recently there was a bulletin that showed, okay, in 2020, there were about 330,000 patients in Oklahoma. And then this year there was 375,000. So we're just chalk those in, those are just yet more data points for us. And
But
to
the
block,
striking thing here is that Oklahoma's got 8% of the population, or 9% of the population is using it, whereas Maryland is only 2%. So the elephant in the room is, why is one 4 times bigger than the other?
exactly. And so this is, I think, where some interesting analytics may be worth bringing in. So one is, could we just assume that everyone in the United States basically has around the same baseline consumption, and then the only variation is just being just the black market essentially, or are there actually systemic differences between consumption in Oklahoma and in Maryland?
So I pause you there for a second, and you see stuff right now with COVID and the misreporting that happened with COVID, for example, in Mexico, and it was underreported. But what some people did is they went in Mexico City, they were able to get death reports by district. And by getting the death reports, they could make an estimate then of what was happening in Mexico City for COVID, way ahead of any published data, which showed it was much higher than expected. In a similar vein, you might be able to say, hey, I get 10 friends or 20 friends or whatever, buy a sample, but just see what the range of use is. Like how many, whatever the unit of measure is it joint doesn't sound like it's a standard measure, but maybe you sell by weight or something. They can tell you, here's the weight that I'm using per month, and see what the difference is. You might find that the distribution's rather small. The difference might be small. You might find that people who use it use some minimum, and that at the maximum there's a limit maybe to how much you could possibly smoke. So that would give you an idea then of that spread. Just knowing what that is, even with a group of 20 people, will tell you something, as opposed to, it's a simple thing for you, relatively simple thing for you to do to get just some basic understanding of what the distribution is. Because you may find that, hey, there's some people who, it could happen, for example, that 80% of the people are light users and 20% are just super heavy. That would be good to know.
I can tell you also, being an Oklahoman myself, that getting a medical marijuana license, at least in Oklahoma, is much easier than some other places. So that could also account for the higher number of individuals that have a medical marijuana license.
But I think Sosha's kind of hit it very hard. You might add another column that says, just subjectively, do we think it's easy, hard, impossible, whatever, to get a license? Because that's, I think Sasha said it directly. I mean, I tangentially, what I think I hear, in my environment is that in California, like, hey, if you're already smoking, how could you make it legal? Oh, let's go get a marijuana license. That's what I kind of think happens, as opposed to, hey, I'm in pain. I tried, painkillers. Now I want to try, I tried CBD. Now I want to go to this, right? So again, I don't know much about the patient process. So I don't know much about what you do to get to be a licensed marijuana receiver. But I think Sasha's, it's got to be something like that. There's a huge difference. And so that would be another predictive variable. Okay. So if you just simply went through the 50 states and say, ask 10 people to say how, there's a lot of value to getting just getting a consensus estimate as to how difficult it is to get a license or get a permit by state. And so you might go saying 10 people, where is it easy? Where is it hard? And I would make it like high, medium, and low. It doesn't have to be very, it's difficult, not difficult. Hey, anybody who wants one gets one. Just some breakdown like that would go a long way to explaining this difference. So your population doesn't change very much. It might change somewhat by state, but the biggest contributing factor here is likely to be how easy or how hard it is. And even though you may look at that and say, well, there's no numbers for that, you can make something called factors. Just being able to say it's high, medium, and low, something like that. That would be very useful in explaining the difference between states.
Exactly. And so, I think, Sasha, what you mentioned, I think that's going to be helpful. So basically we can, start making some assumptions here. So basically we can say, okay, it's easy to get a license in Oklahoma. So maybe this is close to like the upper bound actual number of cannabis consumers. So we can say, okay, maybe almost everyone who consumes cannabis in Oklahoma, falls into these numbers. And so it could be the case that in Maryland that 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 about 6% of cannabis users, they may be using illegal cannabis. Or
it's
not
Growing
not
their
6
own.
or not 6%, but more like 80%, but making up about 6% of the population.
The suggestion of Sasha's making about essentially trying to, or I think Stephen was saying, to quantify the difficulty of obtaining a license as a kind of a measure. You may also look at the different data sources from the time that the application of the license was made until the time it was issued, if they keep track of that, just as another way of trying to figure out how difficult it is to, as a proxy of difficulty.
One thing, this is going to be tough to parse, but I believe they have data on, okay, how much in like tax revenue was brought in from license, so like how much licensing fees were in there. I'm not certain that perhaps the NN license, I'm not certain though. So you may be able to divide that by the actual license cost to try to get the number per month. But so long story short, when you start to look at, the patients and consumers, the data gets a little messier. So we're going to have to be real rigid about any assumptions we make. But essentially, this is just going to be, the beginning of the path. So it's basically, I'm just going to start, collecting the data points that are there for patients, and just to try to start putting together, the demand side of the picture. And then along the way, we can, utilize the census and say, okay, in Oklahoma, we can, use the population, and, we can use like an age factor. So it would be interesting to then just see, okay, can just using a crude panel, because if we add, 30 states or so, or even just 20 states, we can start to get a picture of, okay, are any of these explanatory variables correlated, even just like at a rough level. And then, like I said, then we can even start to make conjectures. So we could say, okay, let's just conjecture that every state has cannabis consumers the same at the same rate as in Oklahoma. Then what would you expect? What would you expect sales to be in those states? And so we could start make estimates. And so then they're just estimates, but they may start to reflect, okay, what's the size of the illegal market? And so we could say, okay, this is the population in Maryland. Then we could say, so, I'm not certain what the populations are off the top of my head, but, you could start, maybe Maryland has a comparable population to South Carolina. not certain the population of South Carolina. But you could start to make comparisons and see, okay, what is the potential demand if, the whole country legalized and everybody had the same consumption rates as in Oklahoma, or everyone had the same consumption rates as in another state. So
a couple things you could look at here. One is that you could say the Oklahoma versus Maryland, the differences between it's like one's like twice the other. Okay, not 10 times, but twice. Okay, so that suggests that on average, there may be, both are averages. It does suggest that, hey, there's probably distribution around that average, for sure there is, but that'll give you an estimate then of how much per user. But you can also see that, hey, because it was easy in Oklahoma, a lot of these presumably already current users said, hey, I'm going to go get that medical thing. So if you want to start to estimate, if you took the perverse point that people on medical marijuana, let's say none of them needed it for marijuana for medical purposes, they just want to smoke it. Then you could suggest, hey, this is really an indication of how difficult it is to get a permit. But you can see that a place where it's easy, you might expect as a hypothesis, as what you call an estimate, you might call it a hypothesis that where it's easy to get a permit, everybody who wants to smoke it for any reason will get a permit. And so I would suggest going and looking at the states that have the easiest rules, and then see if you can find out what percentage of the population there has it, because people might be using the same thing nationwide, might be the same percentage nationwide. And just a quick search, you can get the state by state policies from some place called the Cannabis Industry Org, NCIA News, state by state policies. And so maybe that's a way to kind of go and say, let's pick out the states that are easy, and then go from there.
And putting on my economist hat, the way we could potentially quantify the easiness is just the price. It's maybe a crude measure, but just, okay, how many dollars do you have to pay to get a patient license? So then one could assume that, okay, so in Illinois, you don't need a patient license, so that would just be $0. In Oklahoma, you would use their licensing fee. And then I'm curious, Heather, would you know what the licensing fee, if there is, and if so, what it may be in Maryland?
It depends if you have to renew or not. So the first time that you come in, it might be like $200 cash. And the next time you renew, as cheap as $100 to $150 range. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know for certain, but I want to say that in Oklahoma, actually, I have no idea. I'll have to look this up for next week, but I don't think it's 200. So I want to say it's between 60 and I want to say it's between 60 and 100, but I'll have to look this up to be certain.
Yeah,
Yes, it's
like
expensive
100.
here.
Exactly. And so those are just 2 data points. However, essentially, that would just be a fixed state by state variable.
Yeah.
So basically, we'll just basically start adding variables here. And so it'll just be the patient license cost. And so we'll add this variable, for Maryland, and then we'll add whatever, we'll add Oklahoma's fee here. And so essentially we'll maybe even be able to use those as explanatory factors in, okay, how many patients are there?
Yeah, but it's very small. I mean, just not knowing much about your industry, I can tell that. You might also want to look at, well, I had a question first. Is does the patient pay a different price than the illegal price for marijuana?
Oh,
I don't know, but that's a great question. I will ask around.
Yeah, because
That-
if basically if quote medical use of marijuana had a lower price or a higher price, that would be both. That'd be important. If it was a higher price, it would suggest that, hey, that's a disincentive to go get it. But if it was a lower price or the same price, then hey, I want to join the book club. You know, if
It's
I was
cheaper.
a marijuana user.
It
It's
tends to
cheaper,
be
yeah,
cheaper in
it's
Maryland.
It's like joining in Costco or something, right?
Well, we normally have a guest from Oregon, and I think he could attest to this. So essentially, I think in Oregon, they're going through measures to try to, make sure that everybody is operating in the recreational market. And it's one of the funniest tales because it's basically, they're not, I forget if it's Oregon, I want to say it is, but I feel they're giving subsidies to, to cannabis producers. And so I just thought it was funny where it was just sort of coming full circle, that now something that used to be illegal, strongly illegal, and now they're the government's kind of giving subsidies to get people to to do it legally.
Mhm.
So
In
The other thing
Oklahoma,
you probably
you
could
can.
get,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
the other thing you can probably get numbers on is CBD. So as I understand it, CBD does not have THC. The primary motivation for recreational people, I think, is the THC. So if it's a CBD user, then I think what we'll have is that might be a good indication of the medical use by state. So I would go get CBD numbers by state if you can, because I think it will reflect people doing it for true medical reasons as opposed to, hey, I just wanted to smoke. And then and that's those numbers you probably could get. And that would also probably help you understand better the distribution of medical users as opposed to recreational users. Because you can look at CBD and then compare that to the census data that you can easily download. And you want to get out of Excel because you'll go nuts trying to do it in Excel.
Just to be a devil's advocate here.
Yes.
So from a chemistry standpoint, marijuana has something called cannabinoids. So CBD is one, THC. There are other ones a little bit more obscure like CBN, etc. And the plant itself, medicinally, naturally occurring, not plants that are bred specifically to have high THC, but naturally occurring THC in a plant that has not been modified. The cannabinoids work best together when they are used together. So CBD itself, if you consume CBD, it's guaranteed to have less than like 0.3% or 0.03% THC so that it doesn't register on drug screens. But I think probably some individuals consume THC with their cannabis because it gives them a more holistic medicinal effect.
Yeah, I mean, what you say is, I mean, I don't disagree that there are some people, but I think for most people, they don't get much of a buzz off CBD, as I understand it. And
I would disagree. I'm so sorry. I would disagree. But
okay, so I really don't. I'm speculating.
But I don't know how you would
more. But
point.
So your position is that there are some people who say, "I'm going to take CBD for the buzz." Is it, I mean, I'm looking for your input or for your advice.
You can get quote unquote high, I guess, from CBD, but it's not the same as a THC high. So the quote unquote high is more medicinal, like calmness, lesser anxiety, things like that, when it comes to altered mental state. Would you agree, Heather?
thank you. Well said.
And
So along those lines, then you might want to just go again, ask your 20 people, hey, do any of you guys just take CBD without taking any THC or supplemental marijuana?
Uh-huh.
And that would give you an idea then of the, if you will, the medicinal usage of it. I think in general, and again, I'm speculating here, this is a hypothesis, that the people who are using it medicinally might not be the same people who use it. Well, there's a group of people who literally do use it they have migraine headaches or something, and they literally just want to get the relief from the migraine. They're not looking for the THC. The THC's in it. Well, it's hard to remove THC. It's a small amount. They didn't get it for that effect. And even though it does contribute, it has a specific receptors that it's hitting. It's a different receptor. So,
Yeah. You can never have too many data points.
Exactly. And Sasha, you basically hit on the key here. And basically, I think what it comes down to is, basically, I'm just not satisfied with just kind of just seeing these large estimates like, oh, the illegal market's this big, or oh, the legal market's going to be worth this many in sales in 2020. Right. So it's, or in 2021. So that's why we're going to start essentially collecting these data points ourselves, and then essentially let the data speak for itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, you never know. You might plot some obscure data point that everybody thinks is useless, and it ends up being the outlier that explains everything. You never know.
Exactly. So thanks for bearing with us. So essentially, this is what we're going to be embarking on, in the next week or two, is essentially, so on a state-by-state basis, on a month-by-month basis, so that way we can get estimates for 2021, and we can look at the past. We can see, okay, what are the actual, sales that are occurring in the states? What was their population? If they have a medical program, how many patients are there? And then what proportion of the state is that? And then we can start filling in factors like, okay, what's the licensing cost in that state? What is the age breakdown in that state? And so then these will be explanatory variables, and depending on the size of our data set and the amount of variation, we may not really be able to utilize them to their full extent, or they may not have significant relationships, but it's always worth looking, and we can begin to make plots, and perhaps there may be things that are striking visually that even if they don't have statistical significance. So long story short, that's the road we're embarking on, and I think it'll be fruitful. And so, long story short, we'll put together the Cannabis Data Science estimate of the size of the cannabis market, and then we'll start making we'll basically make scenarios with various assumptions. So we're saying, okay, we may even have a calculator like this. So let's assume that every state consumed similar to Oklahoma, with about, between 8 to 10% of the population consuming. Well, then we could estimate the potential size of the entire US market. Or we may just end up taking the average number of patients once we get even more data points. So once we have Oklahoma and Maryland and Colorado and Washington and Illinois and where have you, we could take the average, and maybe the average is looking 5-6% of the population. So we can play it out, and we can make our own estimate of, okay, what's the size of the current market based on, the Cannabis Data Science Group's estimates. And then we may even be able to estimate, okay, what is the potentially illegal market that's occurring that you may see become, a legal market gradually. Because I'll leave you with this, because basically my joke is okay, as we see this map fill in, once all 50 states are permitting cannabis, then at that point, then maybe the federal government may just have to legalize things by default. So I'm not sure how that works at that point. So long story short, that's the direction I see things going. So, but does anyone else have any comments or thoughts as we round near the end of the hour here?
Well, I just this looks like a market study. So if you wanted to find other things to leverage, there's a lot of literature and so forth about how to do a market study. That's essentially what we're doing here.
Yes.
And then I would and I think that there's a whole lot about data science that would start to come in as to what variables would be predictive and useful. So you want to see which things vary a lot. And the ones that vary a lot are often very helpful for explanatory. And where things that don't vary very much, well, they're not going to be very useful data points because they don't help explain anything because they're not varying. So just a couple things to realize that there's a whole body of knowledge that you can tap into outside of the narrow marijuana industry to better understand how to approach it.
Exactly. And so essentially we are doing a market study. And so because, well, one could imagine if there was federal cannabis laws, then there could be interstate commerce of cannabis. And then you could see, then it would be relevant to companies, the multi-state operators at the moment, but other cannabis companies now, because even if, there was cross-state, then, you could have your craft growers in Oregon, or maybe you have craft growers in Oklahoma just shipping their products to people all over the country. They could be shipping their products to New York or Maryland or where have you. So
I'm just laughing a little bit because there's this other thing that's pretty similar, cigarettes. Turns
yes.
out that the Indian nations are sovereign nations within the United States, and they don't pay federal taxes on their, marijuana or on their cigarettes. It could be, and by the way, these Indian nations ship cigarettes between their nations already today. And so you could have a situation where people say, "Hey, go to your nearest Indian reservation, and you get your marijuana there." and get by a whole bunch. I don't have any insight into that particularly, but you've got, for example, up in Washington State, I know there are big reservations up there, and people go there already to buy gasoline. So if you want to get something nationwide, well, that might be a way that you can legally go to the Indian reservation and buy something. It's not legal to take it off the reservation, perhaps, but.
I can tell you that in Oklahoma, there are several tribes. So anytime you do anything on a reservation, you have to get approval from, I guess you would call the tribal board. So there's a chocolate company called Bedre, and I think it's the Choctaw Nation. I can't remember exactly where, but anyways, anytime that company makes any business decisions, they have to run it by the tribal board. Well, this company was going to partner with the cannabis industry to make edibles, chocolate, etc. But the tribal board would not approve it because they did not want any kind of marijuana or marijuana derivatives on tribal land.
Well, otherwise, I can see why they already have an alcohol problem.
But when it does occur, they could definitely be a cash cow for them, no doubt.
Yeah. Exactly. So lots of opportunities, and as you pointed out, there's, things are still getting hashed out. Everybody's deciding, okay, and even at the local level. So that's the story in Michigan is the local jurisdictions, different in Illinois, and so there'll be, so basically people are deciding, okay, who are going to be the participants. And, some people may opt out, and that's perfectly okay. And so it'll just be, we're just doing our part to just start collecting data just so people can have a lay of the land as the rules are hashed out. So that way, people aren't flying blind. And so that way we can know, okay, this is the consumption rate in Oklahoma. It's similar to state X, Y, and Z, and then you could look at the characteristics in those states. So we're just doing our part to help crunch the numbers, since data analysis is in high demand and low supply.
I really appreciate this group and everyone's insights and background and bringing forth different things that I never even thought about. So I just want to thank everyone for taking out time to be here today. It's super helpful for me.
Definitely. Thank you for coming, Sasha and Stephen and Heather, as always. So next week we'll look at some more numbers. This week we were just kind of talking a lot more. So yeah. So thank you, and yeah, just keep your nose. We'll keep your ear to the ground, and let me know if we were talking about nose. We were talking about terpenes earlier. So yeah, but yeah, let me know if anything sparks your interest or comes across your mind, and we'll pick up again next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Enjoy your week. Bye now.